Okay, so thank you for inviting me for this session and this webinar. Sorry, I have excuse me, I had a window just appearing on my screen. And to the organizers for inviting me. I think it's a very good initiative you had, and I was very happy to answer to it. And then I realized that it's more complex to do than I thought when I say, yes, good idea, I have lots of things to say. So the seminar today will be completely biased to what I've done. So that's why I wrote that I will use past climate simulation to investigate climate change. That's really the topics I'm working on. And the 30-year with the Paleoclimate Modeling Intercomparison Project, because I will not directly tell you everything about PMIP, but perspective from what I have done with PMIP. So why are we this long-term perspective with paleoclimate, and why do we think it's important also to study future climate change? You have here on this figure the evolution of temperature for the Earth, reconstructed from different types of paleoclimate archive. Take care, because on the x-axis is the logarithm scale. And then you see that the Earth, of course, has always varied, and the climate has always been very variable, with warmer periods with lots of instabilities here during glacial times. And then from the last glacial maximum to present day, something more stable in the Holocene where we are. And then if we look where we are heading due to human activity, we realize that we might induce changes depending on what we do. It's different types of projections here you have that is larger than what has happened naturally from glacial to interglacial climate here, for example, and that also larger than what has been experienced by her for the millennia to million years. So in this presentation, I will keep this long-term perspective in mind, but mainly look at last glacial maximum and mid-Holocene that are key reference periods for climate modeling. So the question we addressed, they are really connected to the unknown for the future, looking at things that have to do with what we call climate sensitivities, how it's growing depending of external perturbations of such as greenhouse gases and the pattern behind that. The fact that we have still lots of unknowns in the hydrological cycle and monsoon and what will go on in the future. For example, in Africa, where you have no hatching, telling that different models do not agree on if it's a plus or a minus precipitation change in the future. A question about interannual variability and, for example, the El Nino phenomenon in the tropics, where it's unclear how it will evolve in the future. It's chaotic. And maybe it has also some extreme behavior we need to better address that can be done with paleoclimate. Okay, so when we try to do it, of course, we have a difficulty with climate. Climate is not directly meteorology, even if we are very interested in all the meteorology and how it impacts the environment, but we have to take care about lots of different timescales. And climate is really this connection between meteorology and fast atmosphere and longer reservoirs due to the ocean and the deep ocean in particular, or the biosphere and the fact that vegetation can change as a function of climate, and ice sheets that have also different scales. So this is really a notion that when we look at climate, we need to integrate together what is due to the change in the energy cycle between the different reservoirs, what is due to the change in the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and these three cycles are, of course, entirely connected at different time scales. When we speak of climate also and climate change, we are dealing with a change in energy. For what I've shown, and the driving force for our climate is the solar energy at the top of the atmosphere. It's really the heat engine. It has varied in the past due to changes in the Earth orbit. That's the paleoclimate theory behind lots of glacial, interglacial variations, for example. And then when we change also or add external or human activity with a carbon cycle or whatsoever, we also introduce energetic change. And this has a direct impact on the way the ocean and atmosphere redistribute the energy from the equator to the pole. And the two fluids, atmosphere here in green and ocean here in red, are redistributing energy to compensate for the excess of energy from the solar radiation and the energetic budget at the top of the atmosphere in the tropics compared to what we have in high latitudes. So as soon, each time we do something, we change the energy budget and the relationship between its sources and its sinks, which affect both the temperature, but also all the circulation in the atmosphere and the ocean. So today I will mainly focus on what is due to Earth's orbit and trace gases. Of course, climate is more complex than only these two effects. So I will discuss using a numerical representation of the Earth's climate. These are the complex general circulation model, 3D models, coupling ocean, atmosphere, land surface, sea ice, and this through the energy, water, and carbon cycles. And it's a complex loop, I would say, in all the developments we are doing, from the theory that provides us the equation to the way we put them on the grids, the numerical solution, the coding, the access to the big computers, the way we store the data and analyze them. There is a lot of work here between the simulation and the analysis, and how we use the different types of observations we have, present day and also past climate, to test if the models produce something that is realistic, and test how the Earth will move depending on the external perturbation we impose to them. So what happened in the last 30 years, I would say, is that for climate, at first when I started, we were running on the atmosphere, we were running atmosphere alone model to test climate and climate change. And little by little, this model have become more complex, adding ocean and then land surface, complex land surface, and then the biochemical cycle, including the carbon cycle. So we are no more looking at this atmosphere alone, but a very complex system with all the interactions between the different compartments. So we have a lot about the way to look at these models, even though we still have a lot of questions about the validity of the result and the ingredients we should have. But there is a lot also to think about what we call a bad or a good or a bad model, and how can I use it, because there are lots of different things to consider. And I put this diagram I use for lectures, because sometimes we just forget that the first thing that makes a good or a bad model is the model content, is what are the hypotheses you want to test, and finally, is the model the good one with the right ingredient in there to tackle the question you're addressing? So this concerns the physical representation, dynamical representation, and biochemical cycle if you need them for your studies, but also the resolution of the model you're using. And then the model we have cannot represent everything perfectly, and we have to make compromises between the scales of the model grids and the physics, so that we have some parameterization to represent small scales processes. And these parameters, of course, have uncertainties. And because of this, depending on the parameter you could have in the range of uncertainties, you could have different simulations. Then to run a simulation, you have the forcing. What we call the forcing is the external perturbation we put at the boundary condition in the model. For example, the insolation forcing at the top of the atmosphere. And depending on the simulation you're doing, you have to reconstruct the forcing. And of course, it has also uncertainties. So even if the model is perfect, the result will be affected by these uncertainties. And what we have learned a lot with projects that like PEMIP is that it's not only all that, it's also the way we implement the different forcing and things to run an experiment following an experimental protocol. And with time, we have learned that some model, we think we are doing the same thing, but in practice, when you look at, because of some details, we are not exactly running the same experiments. And then we are speaking more and more about it. It's internal variability, because there's lots of internal noise or signal, depending on what you're doing, that is due just to the interaction between ocean, atmosphere, land, ice, and so on in the climate system. So all these ingredients are important and need to be analyzed with a particular view and different ways of testing the model results. I give you an idea of what's an uncertainty, for example, for simulation of the last glacial maximum. In this simulation, we are doing snapshot experiment. That means that you're around the time period, 21K in our case, and before present, kilo-year before present, sorry. And then you have to define what is the ice sheet configuration you had at this time and that you can impose as a boundary condition in your model. And these are the two reconstructions we use, for example, between two phases of the PMIP project. And then you can see the difference on the right, and that in some places, the dome, exact dome where it's maximum is not exactly at the same place, with quite high differences in terms of elevation between different ice sheets. So this has implication locally on the way you can cool or warm your system and the climate, and also the impact of the ice sheets on the atmospheric circulation, and thereby also on the interactions with the ocean. So these are different things we need to qualify to make when we analyze the results, and also to be able to test the result of the simulation compared to different paleoclimate reconstructions. So for me, these past climate experiences have been done a lot through the Paleoclimate Modeling Intercomparison Project. It's almost of my life, I would say. It started in '91. I was not there at that time. I was just engaged the year after at LSCE. And it's the second of these big MIPS model intercomparison project. It was launched after the atmospheric one. And the idea at that time is that there are lots of modeling, but it was most of the time difficult to fully compare model results and fully make sure that we were speaking exactly of the same thing or the same experiment. That's really the baseline. What's the state of the modeling and what can we learn out of these models? And for the paleo, it was two objectives. They are still valid with same questions. Understand the mechanisms of past climate change and the different climate feedbacks in the system, the ability of climate models to simulate a climate different from today. And this is because, as I told you, we are moving to very big change in the future with human activity. And then we offer different test cases with the paleoclimate outside the range of present day where these models are developed. So PMIP is a very big project now with lots of modeling groups involved and different climate models. These are the same model than the one used for future climate projections, but we also welcome intermediate complexity models in this comparison. There are now several key periods that are organized as MIPS, I would say, with different time horizons. And I just focus on last glacial maximum and mid-Holocene because these are the periods that are there from the beginning. We have also big challenges. We would like to put insolation and have a whole deglaciation from last glacial maximum to present day with interaction with ice sheets and all the climate system. Okay, so that's really the status of PMIP as it is today, but started with two periods in the early time. The PMIP is really in the footstep of COMAP. COMAP was a project in US, and we were very sad to hear that John Kussbach passed away in January. It's really a big figure in the field, and he inspired so many people, including lots of things I've done myself. And they had this project where using the CSM model at that time, they ran snapshot experiment with atmosphere alone simulation. Each dot is a time, an experiment, a different time from 20 kiloyear before present to present day, testing the change in insolation, change in aerosol in atmosphere, ice volumes, and CO2. And I really invite you to look at the early paper, and because all the basic ideas are there, and sometimes you just wonder if we progressed in our ideas. And it's really, they set up the scene to run this climate model, but also to interact between data people and fostering model data comparison. Okay. So what are these periods in PMIP? So the mid-Holocene, it's really an easy test for climate model. It's not an analog for future climate, and that's also another question when you look at things that all these climate are particular, and I don't think we can find an exact analogs. We can find periods that represent more or less a few things we would like that might happen in the future, and it's where we can make analogies. But they tell us a lot about the way the system is behaving and if we are able to capture the different variations. So here what we are looking for the mid-Holocene is really the response to the climate system, to the change in insolation at the top of the atmosphere. So it's represented here as a function of months and latitude. And during this period, because of the Earth's orbit, you have less insolation coming during the boreal winter here in the tropics, and more insolation here in mid and high latitude during boreal summer. It's about 20 watt per meter square. It's, in summer, it's a 5% change compared to present day. So it's not that much. But then what happens is that in summer, you have a big warming here over the continent, about 2 degrees. It's not that big. It's 2 degrees. In the northern hemisphere, you can see that the southern hemisphere is still cold, at least over the ocean, and here over land. And overland is because this warming and the interhemispheric and land sea contrast enhance the monsoon system in the tropics. And then you see the big increase here in monsoon in Africa and India, for example, but also that precipitation during summer are depleted over the ocean. It's really a strengthening of the direction of moisture from the ocean to the continent where it strengthens the monsoon system. So this is for the Holocene, the key things to have in mind. And for the last glacial maximum, it's a time where it's colder climate due to the presence of the big ice sheets, and also a change in coastline due to that, and reduced CO2 compared to present day. And then you can see it's a globally colder and drier climate. And of course, the cooling in Maximum, where you have the big ice sheets, but also in the high northern latitude, part of the cooling is due to a polar amplification of the cooling due to the structure of the atmospheric column in those regions. So these are very two contrasted climates. Okay, just this figure to set up a little bit what was at that time. So it's from an early paper here. It's just to show you the result of some of the models. We had several models. That's the PMIP-1 simulation, first phase of PMIP. And in that time, for the last glacial maximum, we had simulations where sea surface temperature was either prescribed, and it was prescribed to climb up reconstructions. It's a big exercise from the paleoceanographic community. Or it was computed, but using a slab ocean model. So it's only a piece of water that is about 50 meter depth that allows to have the first feedbacks in the radiative fluxes at the surface between ocean and atmosphere. It was widely used for future climate projections about 20 to 30 years ago. So what you can see, each dot is a result of the model for different seasons. The black and green are for the ocean in January, February, or July and August. And the blue and red are for the land. And So you can see that globally we have a colder climate. Here, SST is prescribed. You see almost nothing, a cooling due to the SST, but nothing for the change in precipitation, because it's a temperature change here and precipitation change here. And you see that globally it's colder and drier. But when you have interactive ocean, more or less interactive, at least surface ocean for the fluxes, you can see that there is a broad dispersion in the model result, larger than this one, and that this cooling and drier climate is there for all year long. For the middle ocean is what I said already, it's a change in seasonality. And then you can see the flip-flop between land and ocean. You can see the land in summer, precipitation, in winter, precipitation is reduced over land, it's colder, whereas it's increased over land and warmer during summer, and the flip-flop with ocean where it's exactly the contrary. And it's really due to the insolation forcing, interhemispheric contrast and land sea contrast. Okay, so there's been lots of efforts in really testing the model results against paleoclimate reconstruction. I showed just two of these reconstructions here as an example. What is interesting, we call benchmarking. That means that little by little, we are able to have something systematic. It's not only evaluation, it's really systematic test with numbers. Just to know where we are. And then the basic conclusions are still there, even though we improved little by little, is that the model, we capture the land sea contrast, we capture the big picture, the compared to observations, seasonality, change in precipitation, and so on. But in general, we underestimate the magnitude and the regional features. And is still valid, and we still have to work on that. A very important point for future climate projections is that for when we look at the past, we do not necessarily see a relationship between the ability of climate model to represent modern climate and what they do for paleoclimate. It's just because it's different feedbacks acting in the system as the first order. And this is very important, and is where paleo brings something in the system. Okay, so now I will go through different subjects, very with a bias with my own activity for sure, and even in the reference I present. So I will engage you also to look at the literature from other groups in PEMIP, because they also have done quite a lot on similar subjects. Okay, so I will first. The first one is that last glacial maximum has been a key period to look at climate sensitivity and the response of forcing and feedbacks. And it brings something in the debate of climate sensitivity for future climate. So what is climate sensitivity? The definition is the change in temperature given a change in the external forcing, and it implies a feedback parameter. So that's what we try to better estimate. So for the last glacial maximum, so it's extracted here what we've done in 2012. You have the big forcing. It's an estimate of the forcing with different methods. I don't go into the details for the methods, but lots of thinking behind that, where you see the big forcing here over the ice sheet and the total, when you look at the different models, that is about 3 watts per meter square. We have also reduction in carbon dioxide. It provides you another estimate of the forcing. And for the last glacial maximum, we also changed the elevation of the ice sheet, and this has an direct implication of temperature and long wave radiation. So we can estimate all those terms. And then the latest estimate we have is that and it's a paper by Sherwood et al., where the paleo brings something for future climate, using different lines of evidence for present day, for last glacial maximum, and different types of observation for climate sensitivity. The best estimate we have now from literature is about a change of about 5 degrees for the last glacial maximum, with a big forcing here and error bars behind that. It is about 8 degrees. It depends on how you count the different terms. And then the work that has been done is also to better understand model dispersion in all this and what could be due to clouds in particular. Because when you look at future climate, that's the different dots here in color for different models, the plain dots, and the circle are for last glacial maximum for the same models. And then when you look at feedbacks, you have the feedback that water vapor and lapse rate, the albedo at the surface due to, for example, to snow or ice, the clouds in the long wave and short wave and the total. And what you can see is that the last glacial maximum to compare to what the model do for present day is also a large dispersion for short wave cloud feedback. So it's similar terms than the one that is very important for future climate. But you realize that the sign is different compared to future climate. And it's maybe because climate sensitivity is dependent on the mean state. And then this is something that's still investigated in the community. This graphic is another important graphic on the right, the land-sea contrast, and we can have information from different data sources about the distribution of the cooling over land. That's this figure of the distribution of cooling over the ocean. And then you can check what the different models are doing. And sorry, you do not see the crosses here for the observations. And then the rates between land and ocean is about 1.3, and it's equivalent to what we have for the future. So we can learn something out of this constraint from past climate. And what we know from all the dots and crosses that represent different models is that the model underestimates the equator two-pole gradient because they are on this side of the graphic compared to the crosses and their error bars here. So this is a very famous diagram in PEMIP and is still of use with different versions of it. Okay, so there has been also a lot done to try to connect with hydrological cycle. And for example, here in the tropics, for the future, we have increased warming mostly in the East Pacific, larger than in the West, it's in the upwelling regions. Because of this, the famous Walker cell is slowed down for future climate. So now there's more understanding of that. And when you look what's going on in the past climate, you see a little bit a reverse situation when you're going to the cold climate. And then comparing those climates help also to strengthen the understanding we have on these processes and how it works. And then it's clear that we have the same type of rate of change between temperature and humidity of the atmosphere per degrees of warming or cooling. It's about 7.5%. And we have also find this, that the change in precipitation is more lower, and it's about 2.7 or 3% per Kelvin in the different climates. Similar things here when you add more climate and more about it. So there's lots of consistency in the processes, and it helps to provide guidelines or constraints when we are able to have good idea of this value from or indirectly from different bioarchives. So last example, last glacial maximum is a work that is mainly done at LSE, and only I'm not really in there. It's really how you can connect the dynamics and evaluate a little bit more what's going on in models. So it has to do with the storm tracks. The color is a change in precipitation for different models here. In the red, it's the location of the storm tracks for present day in these different models. So you can see the diversity of what models doing, but they all have a storm track somewhere. And then you can see the storm track from last glacial maximum, where there is a southward shift or differences, but at least there is a shift somewhere in all the simulations. So the processes have been understood is that there's a shift despite the stronger temperature gradients, and it's because we have a reduced efficiency of bioclinic conversion in the atmosphere and different role of the different diabatic processes. And then what has been shown also with time is that the ice sheet and the weights implemented in model can explain some of the differences. And of course, if you have different ice sheets, you also have different patterns. And it's not only connected, the model differences, to the SST pattern as it was thought when all this started. And then you can have a look then at the connection between these storm tracks and precipitation in Morocco and South Spain here, and see that depending on the location of a storm track and the change, you have this connection in the different models with the change in precipitation. And then the data in Morocco can help you to test what is more realistic. Okay, so now I move rapidly to the second period, monsoon at the time of Queen Sarah, which has been one of my major interests, but it's not only the African monsoon I would discuss here. It's just this important period where we know we had more water, increased water in period that is now very dry, and several way of looking at it. And I really like this fresque in Tassili. Okay, so one important study for me with time has been really this connection between the change in seasonality induced by the insolation forcing and Earth's orbit and the response of the monsoon and the relative response between different monsoon systems. And then I plotted this here where from an analogy with what is going on between different periods in the Holocene. So you have present day, and that's the location of the vernal equinox on the ellipse you have here on this graph for present day, from mid-Holocene, and for the early Holocene. Early Holocene is just the opposite to present day, so there is more insolation during summer in the Northern Hemisphere and less during winter, like from mid-Holocene, but clearly the changes are in phase with solstice compared to present day. The maximum is really at the solstice, whereas for the mid-Holocene is slightly shifted in time towards July later period. And we made some analogy what is going on in the previous interglacial periods, and the difference with the present one is the eccentricity, so that all the factors due to obliquity and the precession of the equinox that is represented on this figure are larger. And then I isolated several periods that have similar location for the vernal equinox on the ellipse. And from that, we've looked at the change in monsoon in Africa, in this slide, and India. And then you can see that the channel, of course, the two monsoons are reducing, and this is clearly the basic response to insolation forcing. But more interestingly is that it seems to be more gradual here compared to here, where during mid-Holocene here, or this period in the Eemian, we still have a strong monsoon compared to the earlier period and the period after. And this is really due to the phasing of the perturbation due to insolation with the seasonal development of the different monsoon system. This one, the Indian monsoon being more sensitive to July insolations, and maybe Africa more sensitive to the August insolation. So this seems to make sense, these interpretations, and we are still continuing to try to test it with different paleo indicators, because of course this climate system is not only a response to insolation, there is much more than that coming into place. There's been also lots of studies to try to figure out how we could understand better the role of clouds, of the atmospheric circulation in the system, and I've tried to look at this through relationship between the change in temperature and precipitation to understand better the efficiencies of precipitation and the leakages with the parameterization in the different models. So what you have here is still in summer during June, July, August, or the mid-Holocene compared to present day. You have here the temperature in a box over the continent, it's here over Eurasia, and the precipitation over India here, just an example. So the dots for each color is a different model, models. The dots are for present day for each of this model and the stars for the Mid-Holocene. And you can see that you are on the same line for a given model, except you do not explore exactly in the same, you are at different places with increased precipitation and temperature here, for example, compared to here where you are in summer, and the same for the different models. Of course, the difference between models are larger than the difference between the period, and this is also something to keep in mind. And then finally, we isolate that we needed different parameters to be able to fully distinguish the response in terms of difference in precipitation between the two periods and between models, so that you have an effect when you fit these curves, then you find you have an effect of the mean temperature of present day and the efficiencies of precipitation, so that a warm model could have a similar change in precipitation, this line than a model that is more efficient but is colder. So it's a way to look at these relationships. Okay, so a big change in the way to look at the system has been provided also when we were able to couple ocean and atmosphere to look at climate change and paleoclimate. And I show you one of the first figure I have with different model results. And you have insolation forcing here for the Northern Hemisphere, so still the same, less in winter, more in summer. And then for these different models, each line is a model, but don't worry about the model it is, where you see that over the Northern Hemisphere, when we have prescribed temperature, you have this line for the change in temperature, but then you add the ocean feedbacks. Of course, you have broader dispersion between models, so it adds complexity, but you have a slight shift also in this change in seasonal cycle induced by the inertia provided by the ocean response. And this can vary from one region to the other. What happens also with that, I isolated two models here, the CSM and ATCM2 models, that each of these models produce during summer a dipole response with warmer temperature to the north and colder temperature to the south in the Atlantic, for example. And this has an implication to strengthen the African monsoon. So it's an important factor there, and it builds every year, and it looks a little bit like the dipole we have for interannual variability for present day. And then associated to that, there is a role of a change in the heat transport by the ocean that also has some implication in the maintenance of this dipole and the total response, so that the heat transport by the ocean as a function of months and latitude here. You can see in the Atlantic for the IPSL model, this one, with to the north for a season and to the south for another season. And then you can see that there is a big changes in the heat transport here during the summer months, and it's associated with this response of the ocean and the different gradients that are built up in the Atlantic. So I don't go into the detail, just a snapshot. Another snapshot is that there's been big changes also when we've been able to couple the vegetation and to be able to look at the impact of vegetation. So prior to this fully, so these were first asynchronous coupling with vegetation. And prior to that, there has been quite a lot of experiments using atmosphere and vegetation coupling, right? And these simulations were the first one where with a couple model, we also added the ocean coupling in the system. So the way, and we look at the different feedbacks, starting for present day, have an atmosphere land simulation for Mid-Holocene, a fully coupled ocean atmosphere simulation for the Holocene. Then you use that to force a biomodel and reconstruct the vegetation. And then you inject the vegetation in the couple model or in the atmosphere alone simulations. And then we are able then to look at what's the response, decompose the different factors. And then you look at what's the effect of the direct insolation forcing on the atmosphere and the feedbacks. So for temperature north for 40 degrees north in this figure as a function of months here, the red tells you that the atmospheric response follows the insolation forcing with a cooling during winter and the warming in summer. But then you see that the vegetation feedbacks add the warming during spring and early summer, and that the ocean feedbacks adds a warming in autumn and late summer and autumn. And because of this, you transform something that is fully seasonal with minus and plus to something that is an annual warming in these latitudes. And you have some other similar effects for precipitations. Okay, so this is really important to see that different feedbacks add at different times and that you can transform a forcing that has a shape, for example, seasonally, to something that has another shape that is annual. Okay, so these studies started in practice with the look of African monsoon and all the work that has been done in PEMIP around it. And I just presented it here because it's also a way to introduce a famous, what we call the famous spaghetti diagram for PEMIP, where you look at the function of latitude here, equator is here, sorry, and 30 degrees north. It's a zonal average of a change in precipitation for all these curves as simulated by different PEMIP simulation of the different colors. And then what you have here is the limit where the amount of precipitation you should have to go from desert to steppe. And what you have when you look at the different paleoclimate reconstructions that you can also plot as a function of latitude, you plot all those points on this diagram, is that you have a shift for present day here, you have desert, whereas for Mid-Holocene here, you have some steppe. And then with interaction with people specialists of this environment, you can, they tell you that the transition was about 20 degrees north during Mid-Holocene, so that we need this amount of precipitation to be able to sustain vegetation where we have deserts now. And what you can see, and something where for a long time, is that PEMIP simulations are able to do something, so they increase monsoon, no problem, we are going in the right direction, but all my life has been, how can I have vegetation in this region because we underestimate it. And then the simulations were already at that time done to say, oh, I start from atmosphere, ocean, I use the vegetation reconstruct for here, and I move to atmosphere again and atmosphere ocean. And then you can see the bit feedbacks you have due to the vegetation change and the needed feedback you have between vegetation and ocean to be able to sustain precipitation further north and hopefully be able to grow some vegetation there. So we have made lots of progress in understanding these basic feedbacks, but there's still a lot to do because these dry environments are very, very difficult to represent in climate models. Okay, so, okay, thank you. Still have a few, but I should be able to do. And it's also important to really try to estimate if this vegetation feedback finally is big enough to have a big impact on the radiative forcing and the energetics of the system compared to other feedbacks that are due to clouds, for example, that are very, very strong. And in particular, when you change the monsoon, you have a very, very, very strong feedbacks with clouds in these regions. And then we have made several things to isolate the vegetation feedbacks in the different models. So it's different models you have here. So you see that it's a plus, and the way it's about 4 to 5 watts per meter square, and it has indeed an impact and detectable impact on these regions. And then some models do things strange, or maybe there was an error in the way it was done. But what is also very important when we look at this feedback is we do not forget that part of it is also depends on the quality of your models. And for example, you have two simulations with the IPSL model here that have exactly the same land surface model. The difference is in the atmosphere, and for present day, big difference here on the left, and it's only for present day. And you can see that in one of the simulation, the B, We have a drier monsoon in this region, even though it's not the place where the changes are largest between the two simulations. But then it has a big impact then on the amount of water in the soil when you start your simulation and the way you can grow the vegetation. So just to say that when you're looking at the climate feedback, what we learn a lot is that it does not depend only on one of the model you have one representation. It's also the close connection between the different aspects in your model and your model climatology. And before telling that the feedback is good or bad, sometimes you have to check that if you have other factors interfering, so that in practice you cannot really discuss the exact feedback as you would have liked to. And you need to derive additional simulation to test the full ideas. Okay, so there's also important feedbacks loop, and there's still too few people, to my opinion, that are looking at the monsoon in an integrative way, looking really at things over land and ocean at the same time, at the big loops we have between continent and ocean and this feedback. So example here is what we have in the Indian simulations. In general, in autumn, we are in October here. It's an early simulation with CSM, where you have quarter temperature built at the surface here in the ocean and warmer there. And you also depleted precipitation, increased precipitation. And this means that we have a dipole-like structure as the one we know for interannual variability each year in autumn during mid-Holocene, and that we have a slower withdrawal of the monsoon system from the continent to the ocean. And then we have a big loop to consider that has to do with the fact that increased monsoon in summer brings more water to the continent, and it has also implications for river runoff and more runoff over the ocean, less saline water that has an impact on stratification. And you have also the effect of winds and temperature that change stratification of the ocean. And what we have here for two models is that you can, in this box, so it's not the square is not at the right place, it was in the place where we are warming. Then you can tell that stratification in autumn has a big impact on the amplification of the monsoon, the warming, and then the timing of the withdrawal of the monsoon. So it's really interactive system in the whole hydrological loops, and we still need more investigations and more understanding on that, and to better assess monsoon changes. And it's valid for the future, of course. Okay, so the last topics very rapidly is that there has been a lot also going on with interannual variability, and for a while we are able to look at interannual variability in different paleoclimate records, and it's very nice from coral and bivalve and shells and so on, and also from these different paleoclimate simulations. What is robust is that we know for a long time is that there was reduced ENSO variability during mid-Holocene, and this might not be necessarily as 6K, but over a wide period when you see from the different records on this graph. That's what you have for the different simulations in 2008, where first time we gather the model result for that. Models are going in the right direction, but they are underestimated the response compared to the different proxy records by reconstructions. And it was true in 2008, it is true in this IMIJ paper that has been a very important paper for that. And we need to go on and understand better, but we have a way to test the response of the different models. Okay, so I will skip this one. It was just on the processes and why ENSO is reduced. I think we made progress on that. And also for a long time, we have tried to investigate a little bit more the different teleconnections in the system. knowing that at regional scale, it's not only one phenomenon that affects the environment or the change in vegetation, it's different or extreme events. It depends on lots of teleconnections, and in particular for the tropics, the ones that are connected to the El Nino events and what we call ENSO variability. And then as early as 2007, we were able to check some of these connections between ENSO and precipitation in Sahel in the different PMIP simulation. And the conclusion, when we look at the strength of the connection between the two, what we have on the ocean and what we have on precipitation of the land, is that model have very diverse response for present day. It's violin here, but most of them have a reduced teleconnection for the Middle Ocean, which is consistent with the reduced activity and so activity. So all these things are continuing, I would say, at this time. And we are in a new, I would say, threshold in the community now. Is that for a long time we had these Middle Ocean simulations, and they will remain valid for a long time, because for me it's very important that we have a key experiment we can redo with different model configurations through time to really test where we are, and not and this not only with one web but with several models. But then we are moving now to a world where we are able to have very long transient simulations, and there have been some for the Holocene, but also Trace 21 is a big deglaciation one, and so on, with different perspectives for people, question with the optimum feedbacks and so on, and the red one are the one I'm interested in. And with this, we can continue to look also at this teleconnection variability and so on. It's an example from a recent paper we have for the 2 monsoon, where we're just trying to test the relative change in monsoon at the different scale of variability. And here's only a result with 2 model simulation, V01 and SR2 with the IPSL model, and the decrease, long-term decrease in monsoon in Africa in those 2 simulations, and in India, those 2 there, and Africa here. So you can see some difference in timing, but that's not the point here. The point is that variability might be very different, change in variability might be very different from one region to the other. And when you look at the change in precipitation here and the change in the variability in precipitation here, you can see that for India, you have a decreased precipitation, but increased variability, and this in the 2 simulations, whereas it's the contrary for Africa. So we need to test with observations, of course. And then also that variability is very chaotic, and that there are lots of time scale, but there are part of it is a robust signal. So there's really new ways, new types of analysis to develop to really be able to look at the different time scales and their interactions, and this is clearly where we are heading now. Okay, so it's still important, and the cursor says it by itself, that paleoclimate is well associated with what is going on for other research and with modeling in particular for future and the understanding of the climate system, because it brings complementary views and long-term perspective. And the long-term perspective is not only, and that's what we will have in the future, not only on these long-term things, but also how variability at different scales interact with the change in the mean states. And it's very relevant for what we're looking at for future climate. I really believe we still need to better use paleoclimate model evaluation as done, for example, in PMIP, in model developments and in model tuning. And it's quite difficult, but there's a lot to do, because we unlock the vision of the different feedbacks and the way to look at the system with the paleo. And then we will be able to have a better insight into centennial variability that is in between interannual to multidecadal and millennium. And this variability is certainly important also to better understand the predictability of the climate system on, and then maybe have better projection for the future, or better projection for the future. So thank you. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for this overview of the PMIP project. I think we've appreciated again the complexity of these climate models, integrating all sources of feedbacks. And I think it's very important to have this PMIP project to understand the internal variability and these long-term feedbacks of the climate system. So I will just go to the Q&A now. So the first question.
I stopped to share screen, right?
As you want.
I hope it works. Yes, okay, it's okay.
So, so the first question is by Tond Iverson, asking, how do you define forcing in paleoclimate runs? In the Anthropocene, it's normally defined relative to pre-industrial conditions.
Yeah, we do the same. So the reference is present there or pre-industrial, and this varies also depending on what you're doing, but that's really the same. So the question is, how large is the energy perturbation or the radiative perturbation compared to what we have for present day or pre-industrial? And all the measures are compared to that. So when I say we have different methods, for example, to estimate that for the last glacial maximum, in practice, some people are using exactly the same methods, and for future climate, you use a radiative kernel from your model, and then you change one by one the different elements you impose to your system to estimate what's the forcing and what are the feedbacks.
Okay, thank you. So next question by Annalisa Kerki. What do you see as a priority in the future of PMIP? More periods to analyze, different experimental protocols, new processes in the models, etc.
Good question. So my feeling about all those MIPS and PMIP in particular is that we should not have too many periods of reference where we all run the same thing, because it's very demanding. And then it's need for me to be seen really as reference for interaction, knowing more what we have in the model, how they react, and making sure we speak about the same thing, because otherwise we all have the best model on Earth. And then it's very, very interesting to do that. And to be honest, I progress myself a lot by looking not only at the model I was developing, but at also the result of other models. So this is very important. Then we are looking at climate and climate change. And when you're running paleo, even for me, I'm more a physician somehow, and specialist for air fluxes. But you realize that the first thing that is moving is environment, and that you need to understand the thresholds. Is the climate change big enough so that you see something on the environment? And we have all this point. And then complexity in terms of having the coupling with more interaction and cycle and complexity is absolutely needed. And we also need absolutely to have, of course, for paleo, longer simulations and also ensemble. So the point for me is that for climate, I'm unable to say that we need first resolution or whatsoever, complexity or ensemble. We need all of them. Now for PMIP, clearly there's still a lot to analyze. And we are moving to something, I hope that we'll still have this period of reference, minimum one, and there will be more about the multi-coupling and the long-term and the transients, for sure. And I really think there is a lot to do on this variability of aspects on one hand, because we know, but the system is extremely chaotic, and we need to investigate how we extract the signal from the big noise, or it's not noise, how we isolate some key events, and we can check the importance they have on the environment. Do they tell us about, I don't like the word typing points myself, to be honest, but the threshold of things that happens in the system. So that's really one way. And the second way for PMIP is really deglaciation. I call this a big challenge, and it's a big challenge because it's where we are going with complexity, and we want to test how far we can go by just imposing the minimum to a big system that is building its own consistency, internal consistency. And deglaciation is really a challenge for that, because you need the coupling also with the ice sheets, biochemical cycle, particular carbon cycle in there.
Okay, thank you. She has a second question, Annalisa Kerki. Considering the changes in variability and the diversity in the regional monsoons, the global monsoon framework remains a valid or useful metric for understanding monsoons in the future?
Yes, I think so, because sometimes I have a feeling the framework is misunderstood as if, because we are looking at global monsoon, everything should vary the same way everywhere as a global monsoon. But I like the definition of global monsoon because it highlights the regions that are really considered as monsoon and how they vary. And the challenge, and there are a few things that started in PMIP with that, is to look using the framework of global monsoon and defining your region, then you can isolate how it moves into the different regions. Are they synchronous or not? And within the region, is it homogeneous or north, south, east, west changes? So for me, it's a good framework to connect both the global view, because we know everything is connected through Hadley cells and seasonality somehow. But regionally, you can have differences because of the regional response to a given forcing, or because of regional feedbacks. I don't know if I answer exactly what you were looking for. Yeah, so no problem for me with the global monsoon.
Okay, good to know. So another question by R. Zaharia. Many thanks for this presentation. If I'm not wrong, one of the slides you have skipped about 10 minutes ago was about wind influence on ocean temperature. That is on a key variable for the contrast between land and ocean. I'm interested by your eventual comments because I believe that the present level of knowledge on the feedback of wind on ocean surface, or the other way around, is too low.
I would say yes or not. What I think is too low is really to look at the system with the imbrication between these changes in dynamics and thermodynamics somehow. And it's where we have more to do. So I think, I don't know exactly which slide you were referring to. I know I skipped the slide of ANSO and the linkages between winds and thermocline. That is clear that what we, and it's a question for paleoclimate and the way we look at it, is that there is, from the paleoclimate reconstruction, there is this notion that for sea surface temperature, we should see something that looks like, it should be for Middle Holocene, Niña-like mean state or change. And in practice, from all the simulation I've run and seen, I do not see this at the surface. For me, the sea surface temperature, you see it for some of the season, but not in annual mean as the thinking is. But what you see is that you see it in the heat content in the ocean. So it's really something that is related to the thermocline depths, and it's related to the direct connection with winds in the surface in the tropics and the change in the dynamics and the thermocline. And maybe not specifically directly on SST, that is also affected by the different heat fluxes. Okay, so it's a complex thing. There's still a lot to do, and this I fully agree with you.
Maybe it's also related to, I mean, or an extra challenge is that the observations do not give a good, clear picture of what's happening in the ocean in terms of this
But for the ocean, it's very difficult in practice. You need to really understand what is recorded and how you do it. What is very nice at the moment is that we are moving also in a new world where we have also the complexities also for us that this model incorporates more biochemical cycle, and we can make more easily now linkages between other types of model like impact models with direct variables to connect. There's also audit tracers in the ocean simulations, there are isotopes. So we need to make use of all of this to really understand what is the recording and how we use it to test those models. It has also to do somehow with the fact that it's not only for paleoclimate communities, also for the future climate community or whatsoever, the vocabulary we use. And for example, when we discuss variability, it's very difficult because sometimes people have seen a signal and they call it Niño-like or Niña-like, when in practice there's a change in mean, and it has nothing to do with Niño and Niña, right? It's just because the basic change has something to do with changes in east and west of the Pacific and so on. And we have to refine all this to make sure we discuss the right thing between people and the way to look at it.
A next question by Trond Iverson. How is atmospheric mineral dust treated in PMIP models? For example, for the last glacial maximum simulations, online or prescribed?
Okay, so in most simulation I've shown is prescribed. But then there are also different levels of models. And with time, this has improved a lot. So that means that, but I cannot tell you exactly in each of the model, but invite you to look at what was reported in the IR5, because there is each time there is an IPCC assessment. It's also a good period to have the synthesis of what's in the different model and the complexity in these models. And in the IR5, there is a big table in chapter 9, where you can have an idea what is interactive or not in the different models, and these are the same models. But with time, it's clear at first there was almost nothing, or something imposed. In a second time, in most models now, there is, even if dust and so on are prescribed, it's fully interactive with the radiative codes in the models. And little by little, we will see model with interactive dust and aerosols, but they are more expensive, so it's little by little. So there should be, and it has been a big push now in PMIP for this phase, that we will have more simulation with interactive dust, and in all the PMIP protocol, we propose something for the dusts. So we'll see what happens in the next years.
Okay. Next question by Federico Grazzini. Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm interested in understanding the role of a warming ocean and the change in seasonality of precipitation. You mentioned the example of African monsoon, but did you find evidence on changes in mid-latitude weather or of the storm track in general in the mid-Holocene?
We have also changes in mid-latitude and storm tracks during the mid-Holocene. I personally do not look at that in the details. There are lots of questions also with the linkages between that and the precipitation of the land. And we have evidence for a long time that we have a mid-continental aridity in mid-Holocene in most simulations that is not recorded in the paleo reconstructions. And there is a paper by Bartlein et al. That shows that it's because we do not propagate enough into the continent the water from the ocean. So these are still things to analyze in details. We have also something very important for the mid-Holocene that is linked to the fact that due to the change in seasonality, warmer climate, change in seasonality, warmer summer, and the change also over the Arctic with sea ice, that all of this is amplifying the signal in these latitudes. We have a northward shift of the boundary of forest to the north, and this has also lots of implication in terms of feedbacks. And these are things that are also analyzed by part of the community.
Okay. And then a question by Valerio Lembo. I know it's not exactly the focus of your research, but having a broad view of the modeling efforts in the PMIP community, what are the basic ingredients for having ENSO variability in a simplified model?
So what's interesting, you know, that the story of ENSO variability with models started with the Kenzie-Biak model, and it's really the first experiments by Amy Clement. So in that case, the model is really suited for tropics as part of its simplification, and then it's where she showed really that there's this link with insolation forcing and the reduced ENSO variability. For what we are doing now, that's clear that we are still, I think, in a world, and we need to refine the total view we have on this reduction of ENSO. That if you look at all the papers and that have been published, that's we all have a reduction, and then we know that the thermocline feedback is a big feedback in this system. But when you look at the different explanations in the different papers, some invoke the link with the monsoon and the change in the vocal cells. Some invoke only the thermocline or the mean state. I have more difficulties with the mean state. There's also this fact that the mixed layer was deeper at one stage in the Pacific Ocean, so that you have less, how would you say, a fingerprint of your variability, at least on SST at the surface. And then there are other hypotheses also with what is going on with the feedback loops from the convection in the ocean from mid-latitudes from the Southern Ocean. So all this, the relative, I really believe all these ingredients are part of the story. But what's the exact relative strength for them? There's been lots of progress, but we still need to dig a little bit more. And the other point is that, and this we are working on it now, also a lot of people, is that we also have this diversity of ENSO events. And the difficulty, I think, to go to the point is that most of the analysis we are doing or people are doing is with the present day view. But when you look at the Holocene, you need to take into account that the mean state, the seasonality, and the variability have changed. So you're not just looking at change in interannual variability compared to present day. You have all these pieces. And we know, for example, that ENSO is attached to the seasonal cycle. So it's also attached to the specific patterns of this seasonal cycle. And all this interfere. And then it's where I think we still have to progress. And a lot can be done. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I guess you do not need all of these aspects to have ENSO-like behavior, but if you do not take all of them correctly into account, I guess you can draw the wrong conclusions.
Yeah, that's the point. And that's also another conclusion of all our simulation in PMIP. What I've shown you from different models, and some of them you can say, what's the climatology on this model? But finally, the basic response, it might not be at the right place. It might not be for the exact good reason, but then they do it. They do something that makes sense. And that is reassuring us somehow. And of course, it's where to go the step further, it's where we have difficulties. Where we have difficulties too is all these questions I've started to discuss at the end of my talk about teleconnections. And if we want to have the right teleconnections, then you need to have something right in terms of patterns. And it has to do, of course, with wave propagation in the atmosphere or in the ocean, because you have to go through the right pathways. And it's where we have to progress, and I think we still have lots of work to
do. Okay, great. So I think that's all for the Q&A. So thank you very much for answering all these questions and for the great presentation.